The old theater was a relic of a bygone era, a dusty monument to a time when fear was a shared experience. And the flickering light of the silver screen was the only thing separating the audience from the monsters lurking in the dark. The walls were peeling, the seats were frayed, and the air was thick with the scent of stale popcorn and something more sinister. Fear. It was the perfect setting for the double feature of the night, The Tingler and The Phantom of the Opera. As the patrons filed in, their laughter echoed through the cavernous room, oblivious to the darkness that would soon envelop them. Among them was a woman named Clara, her heart racing with anticipation. She had come alone, drawn by the allure of the macabre, seeking a thrill that would make her feel alive. Little did she know that the true horror was not confined to the screen. The lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The film began, and the audience settled into a tense silence, eyes fixated on the screen. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine as the story unfolded. A tale of a creature that thrived on fear, a creature that could only be seen by those who screamed. It was absurd, ridiculous even, but in that moment, the absurdity felt real, palpable. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the silence, echoing from the back of the theater. Clara's heart stopped as she turned to see a man, his face twisted in terror, pointing at something unseen. "It's coming! The Tingler!" he yelled, his voice cracking. The audience erupted into laughter, dismissing him as a prankster. But Clara's laughter faded as she caught a glimpse of something slithering in the shadows, a dark movement that seemed to pulse with life. "Stop it! You're scaring people!" a woman shouted, her voice trembling. But the man remained fixated, his eyes wide with horror. Clara leaned forward, straining to see what he was seeing. The shadows flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw a shape, long and twisted, like a spine made of shadows. Her breath quickened, and she felt the familiar grip of fear tighten around her heart. The scene on the screen grew more frantic. A character was trapped, suffocated by the very essence of fear itself. The audience gasped and screamed, but Clara felt something different, a strange sensation crawling up her spine, a tingling that left her breathless. She glanced at the man again, his face pale and trembling, and her gut twisted with foreboding. Chapter 2. As the film reached its climax, the man in the back stood up, his eyes wild. "It's real! It's in here with us!" he screamed, and this time, the laughter faded into an uncomfortable silence. Clara's heart raced. Was it just the movie, or was something truly lurking among them? The lights flickered, adding to the disorientation, and the screen flashed images of the Tingler, a grotesque creature writhing in agony. "Everyone scream! It's the only way to fight it!" the man shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream, but fear held her captive, a vice around her chest. As if on cue, the audience erupted into terrified shrieks, but amidst the chaos, Clara felt an eerie calm wash over her. The screams echoed, bouncing off the walls, building a crescendo that felt almost tangible. Suddenly, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the theater whole, and the screams morphed into a cacophony of panic. Clara's heart raced as she fumbled in the dark, her fingers brushing against the sticky seat beside her. She could hear the frantic breaths of her fellow audience members, the rustling of clothes, and then an unmistakable sound, a wet, slithering noise creeping closer. "Help! Someone help!" another voice cried out, trembling with fear. Clara's pulse quickened as she clutched the seat's armrest, feeling the sweat on her palms. She could almost feel the creature's breath on her neck, hear the whispers of its dark hunger echoing in her ears. "It's coming for us!" the voice continued, and she knew she had to get out. She stood, her legs trembling beneath her, and started toward the exit. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. With each step, she was acutely aware of the presence behind her, an unseen specter that thrived on the terror surrounding her. The slithering grew louder, an insatiable hunger creeping toward her. "Clara, where are you?" a voice called, but the panic drowned out the familiarity. It was a friend, a voice she recognized, but it felt distant, lost in the midst of chaos. She stumbled forward, her foot catching on something cold and slimy, and she fell, her palm scraping against the floor. The darkness swallowed her cries, and the wet, slithering noise grew closer, a mocking reminder of her fear. Chapter 3. Just when she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, the lights flickered back on, revealing the theater's interior in a grotesque tableau. The audience was frozen in place, eyes wide, mouths agape, some still screaming while others were eerily silent. The man's face was pale, his eyes darting around the room in terror. He was the only one who appeared to be aware of the horror that had manifested. Clara struggled to her feet, her heart pounding. She looked around, and her stomach dropped as she saw the truth. The Tingler was real, not just a figment of imagination. It was slithering among the seats, weaving through the terrified patrons like a serpent through grass, its elongated body glistening in the harsh light. The creature was a mass of writhing limbs and jagged teeth, its eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. "Get out! It's feeding on our fear!" the man screamed, but it was too late. The Tingler lunged, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth as it devoured the closest victim, a woman in the front row, her scream echoing through the theater, a sound that would haunt Clara for the rest of her life. The panic erupted anew, and Clara turned to run. But the creature was everywhere, feeding off the chaos, feeding off the fear that saturated the air. It lunged at another patron, tearing into flesh with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed, painting the walls in a macabre display, and Clara felt the bile rise in her throat. The screams morphed into a symphony of horror, a concert of death that drowned out the sound of her own heart beating. She stumbled back, her mind racing as she tried to grasp the reality of what was happening. The Tingler was not just a monster on the screen, it was here, feeding on the fear that gripped the audience, and there was no escape. The theater was a trap, a coffin filled with the echoes of terror and the scent of blood. As the creature devoured another victim, Clara felt her legs give way beneath her. She sank to the floor, paralyzed by the horror unfolding around her. The screams faded into silence, replaced by the sickening sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking. The last thing she saw before the darkness engulfed her was the creature, glistening and insatiable, feasting on the remnants of fear that had once filled the theater. The lights flickered once more, and the film continued to roll, the audience now reduced to a macabre feast. The Tingler had claimed its victims, and as Clara's mind slipped into oblivion, she realized the truth. Fear was the monster, and it had always been lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. The theater, once a place of laughter and thrills, had become a tomb, a testament to the brutal reality of terror. In the end, there was no escape, only the lingering echo of screams that would never fade. The Tingler had feasted, and all that remained was the silence of the grave, a darkness that devoured hope, leaving nothing but despair in its wake. Chapter 1. The house loomed, an architectural monstrosity draped in shadows, with peeling paint and a creaking facade that seemed to sigh under the weight of its own history. I was drawn here, pulled into its suffocating embrace by a summons from my husband, an esteemed doctor whose arrogance had long since eclipsed my own desires. "Rest," he insisted, "is what you need." But rest was merely a prison in disguise, a gilded cage from which I could not escape. I was to stay in this room, a nursery once, filled with remnants of childlike innocence now tainted by time. The wallpaper was a sickly shade of yellow, a color that seemed to pulse and writhe under dim light, patterns swirling like the tendrils of a beast. Each day I awoke to the sight of it, its faded stains like the remnants of something grotesque, something that had once lived and now lay twisted beneath layers of neglect. My husband, John, with his placating voice and patronizing tone, assured me that the isolation was necessary for my recovery. "You're simply imagining things," he would say, his brows furrowing with concern that never quite reached his eyes. "You need to stop overthinking." But how could I stop when the wallpaper whispered secrets in the dark, when it seemed to breathe and conspire against me, its yellow hue morphing into shadows that stretched like gnarled fingers across the room? As the days blurred into one another, I found myself fixated on the wallpaper, tracing its patterns with my fingertips, as if seeking to unearth its hidden truths. There was something alive beneath the surface, something that clawed to break free. I could feel it, feel the desperate energy pulsating within the fibers. I have to peel it away, I muttered to myself, the words tumbling like a chant. I must set it free. But John would not hear of it. It's just wallpaper, my dear, he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. You mustn't concern yourself with such trivialities. Yet each word felt like a dagger, piercing deeper into my psyche, and I could feel the walls closing in on me, suffocating me with their oppressive embrace. Chapter 2. The first night I heard her, a soft rustling, a whisper of movement that sent chills skittering down my spine. I sat upright in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my own breath. Is someone there? I called, my voice trembling in the darkness. Silence answered, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud. Days turned into weeks, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. I began to see her, faint outlines in the corners of my vision, darting just out of reach. She was trapped, just like me, ensnared by the yellow wallpaper that held her prisoner. I felt an unholy kinship with her, an understanding that transcended the boundaries of sanity. She was my reflection, my darker self, and I longed to free her. I must take it down, I murmured one night, the moonlight glinting off the peeling edges of the wallpaper. My fingers twitched with the need to tear and claw at the grotesque patterns, to reveal the secrets hidden beneath. I could almost hear her whispering, urging me on, her voice a siren's call echoing in the void. Desperation clawed at my mind as I began to peel away the layers. Each scrap of wallpaper that fell away was a victory, a liberation of sorts. My heart raced with the thrill of discovery, the promise of something dark lurking just beneath the surface. But as I tore, I could feel John's presence looming like a storm cloud, his disapproval suffocating me. You're losing yourself, he would say, eyes narrowing with concern. You must stop this madness. But madness was my only companion. Each night I sank deeper into its embrace, the wallpaper becoming my obsession. I could see her now, a figure writhing behind the yellow, her desperation mirroring my own. Help me, she seemed to plead, her silent screams echoing in my mind. Free me from this prison. Chapter 3. The final night arrived like a tempest, swirling with the energy of my unraveling mind. I had clawed and scraped until my fingers were raw, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble at the intensity of my determination. The yellow wallpaper was nearly gone, shredded remnants littering the floor like the fallen petals of a cursed flower. In the moonlight I could see her clearly now, her visage distorted, wild hair and sunken eyes that bore the weight of 1,000 torments. She was beautiful in her madness, a twisted reflection of my own soul. We are one, I whispered, a sense of euphoric unity washing over me. I will set you free. With a final, frenzied effort, I tore down the last remnants of the wallpaper, the fabric ripping apart with a satisfying sound, revealing a wall marred by darkness, stains that looked like blood, like the remnants of something long dead. And in that moment, as the last vestiges of my sanity slipped away, I felt the liberation of her spirit intertwining with my own. The door burst open, and there stood John, eyes wide with horror, his face a mask of disbelief. What have you done? He gasped, stepping back as if I were a monster. But I was beyond his comprehension, beyond the constraints of his reality. I've set her free, I screamed, the words pouring from my lips like a cathartic release. We will no longer be prisoners. And with that, I felt the last shreds of my identity dissolve. Together, we danced in the moonlight, the echoes of my laughter mingling with her haunting cries. As John collapsed, eyes wide in terror, I felt a surge of triumph. I am no longer yours, I whispered, my voice a chilling melody. I am her, and she is me. The walls closed in one last time, the darkness swallowing us whole. In the end, there was no escape, no hope for salvation, only the suffocating embrace of the yellow wallpaper, forever binding us in a twisted union of despair. Chapter 1. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the room as I sat in my study. The light filtered through the dusty window, illuminating the scattered remnants of my sanity. Books lay open, their pages yellowed with age, filled with the ramblings of great minds. Yet despite the wisdom contained within their words, all I could think of was the insidious presence that had seeped into my life, a malevolent force that seemed to lurk just beyond the veil of reality. It began innocently enough, an unusual chill creeping through the air, a whisper of something unseen brushing against my skin. I dismissed it at first, attributing my unease to the stress of my work. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling morphed into something darker, a palpable dread that wrapped itself around my throat like a noose. "What's wrong with you?" my friend Charles asked one evening, concern etched across his face. We sat in my dimly lit study, the flickering candle casting ominous shadows that danced along the walls. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something is here with me, Charles. Something I cannot see." He chuckled, trying to dispel the tension. "You need to get out more, my friend. Perhaps a trip to the coast will clear your mind." But I knew it wasn't that simple. I felt the presence, an unseen observer, a shadow that taunted me from the corners of my vision. Sometimes in the dead of night, I could hear it breathing, the soft rasp of air that sent shivers coursing down my spine. The walls of my home closed in around me, suffocating me in a cocoon of madness. The next day, I decided to confront my tormentor. I sat in the center of the room, surrounded by candles, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow over the dim space. I closed my eyes, summoning the courage I had left. "What do you want from me?" I demanded into the silence. "Show yourself." The air thickened, and I felt a rush of cold wash over me, like the grip of death. My heart raced as I opened my eyes, and in that moment, I saw it. A dark shape, amorphous and undulating, hovering just beyond the edge of my perception. It was there, and yet not there, a grotesque mockery of existence. "Do you see me?" a voice whispered, echoing in my mind, a chorus of malice and despair. "You cannot escape me." I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. "What are you?" I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. "I am you," it replied, each syllable laced with venom. "I am your fears, your regrets, your darkest desires. You cannot banish me, for I am the truth you refuse to acknowledge." I felt my mind fracturing under the weight of its revelation. It was right. I had buried my fears deep within, but now they clawed their way to the surface, raw and bleeding. Memories long forgotten surfaced, faces twisted in agony, moments of weakness that had marked my soul. I saw the children I had failed to save, their screams echoing in my ears, their blood staining my hands. "Stop!" I cried, clutching my head as if I could physically crush the memories back into the darkness. "You're lying!" But the truth was relentless, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Each night, the presence grew stronger, feeding on my despair, dragging me deeper into the abyss. I became a mere shell of myself, a wandering ghost trapped in a world of horror. Chapter 2. Days blurred into nights, and the walls of my study became my prison. I could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmarish visions that plagued me. I stopped answering the door, stopped responding to Charles's calls. I became a recluse, terrified of what lay beyond my threshold. One evening the door creaked open, and I found Charles standing there, his face pale with concern. "I was worried about you," he said, stepping into the suffocating gloom. "You've been gone for too long." "I can't," I replied, my voice trembling. "You don't understand. It's here with me." "Who? What are you talking about?" His brow furrowed, confusion evident. "It's a creature, a thing that feeds on my fear. I can't let it out." My heart raced as I recalled the shape lurking in the shadows, the voice that twisted my mind into knots. He stepped closer, his expression softening. "You need help. This isn't like you. Let me in, please." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't let him in. I couldn't expose him to the horror that had taken root in my soul. "You have to leave," I said. my voice breaking. It's too late for me. But he pushed through, and I felt a surge of panic. No! I shouted, lunging toward him. But it was too late. The moment he entered, the room thickened with dread, the presence swirling around us like a storm. Do you feel that? I gasped, clutching his arm. It's here! He looked around, bewildered. What are you talking about? There's nothing here. But I knew better. I could feel it coiling around us, its breath like ice against my skin. It's coming for you, I screamed, but the words fell on deaf ears. In an instant, the shadows coalesced, forming a grotesque figure that loomed over us, its eyes like black voids. You brought him here, it hissed, the voice an amalgamation of my fears and regrets. Now he must pay for your sins? Get away from him, I shouted, but it was too late. The creature lunged, and Charles's scream echoed through the room, a sound that would haunt me for all eternity. I watched in horror as it wrapped its tendrils around him, dragging him into the abyss, his body twisting and contorting as he fought against the invisible force. No, I cried, reaching out, but it was as if I were grasping at smoke. The darkness enveloped him, and then it was over. Charles was gone, swallowed whole by the nightmare I had unleashed. I fell to my knees, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. I had condemned him to this hell, and the laughter of the creature reverberated in my skull. You are alone now, it taunted, the words laced with a cruel delight. Embrace your despair. Chapter 3. In the days that followed, I was lost in a fog of guilt and grief. I wandered the empty halls of my home, a specter in my own life. The presence lingered, a constant reminder of my failure, the weight of it crushing me from within. I could hear whispers in the dark, the echoes of Charles's voice, pleading for release. Why did you let me in? He would ask, his tone filled with betrayal. You knew what it was. I tried to drown it out, to silence the guilt that gnawed at my soul, but it was futile. I could feel the creature growing stronger, feeding off my sorrow until it became a festering wound in my mind. My sanity frayed, slipping through my fingers like sand. Finally, I reached my breaking point. I could no longer bear the weight of my guilt, the suffocating darkness that surrounded me. I had to end it, end the torment once and for all. I gathered the last remnants of my strength and made my way to the river, the cold water glistening under the moonlight. As I stood at the edge, I felt the presence close in around me, a suffocating embrace. You cannot escape, it whispered, its breath like ice against my skin. You are mine. I'd rather die than live with you, I spat, tears streaming down my face. But deep down, I felt the truth of its words. I was trapped in a cycle of despair, and there was no way out. With a final surge of desperation, I plunged into the icy depths, the water closing around me like a shroud. I could feel the creature's laughter echoing in my mind as I sank deeper, dragging me into the abyss. Darkness enveloped me, and for a moment, I thought I might find peace. But then I felt it, its icy grip on my soul, pulling me back to the surface. You cannot escape, it hissed as I gasped for air. You will never be free. And as I flailed against the current, the realization hit me with the force of a wave. There was no escape from the horror I had created. I was forever trapped in a cycle of torment and despair, haunted by the ghosts of my past, my fate sealed in blood and sorrow. In the end, the river became my prison, a reminder that some horrors are not meant to be escaped. The darkness enveloped me, and with my last breath I understood the truth. I was never truly alive, only a vessel for the horrors that lurked within, destined to drown in my own despair. Chapter 1. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay as I trudged through the snow-laden forest, my breath forming clouds in the biting cold. I had come to the wilderness to escape the chaos of civilization, a reprieve from the relentless grind of city life. But the woods had a way of swallowing you whole, and the deeper I ventured, the more I felt their cold grasp tighten around me. My name is Edward, and I had always been fascinated by the myths of the Wendigo, the malevolent spirit that thrived on the suffering of lost souls. I had scoffed at the warnings of the locals, thinking it mere superstition, an old wives' tale designed to scare children. But now, with the trees towering like ancient sentinels and the silence so profound it felt almost alive, I began to wonder. The stories spoke of a creature that roamed these woods, a specter of hunger and despair, a twisted reflection of humanity that had succumbed to its primal instincts. I had come to gather stories, to write about the folklore that surrounded this region, but the further I walked, the more I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. I was not alone. "Keep moving, Edward. Just a few more miles to the cabin," I muttered to myself, shaking off the encroaching darkness that seemed to seep into my bones. I could almost hear the whispers of the forest, taunting me, as if they knew I was a trespasser in their domain. And then, amidst the trees, I spotted a figure, tall, emaciated, its limbs long and spindly, as if they were branches reaching for the sky. My heart raced, pounding against my rib cage as I squinted through the falling snow. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. The figure tilted its head, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the glint of eyes reflecting the light. But then it vanished into the shadows, leaving only an echo of terror in its wake. I quickened my pace, the crunch of snow beneath my boots a harsh reminder of my solitude. I could hear the wind howl, a mournful cry that sent chills down my spine. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a twilight gloom. I fumbled with the key, my hands trembling as I pushed the door open, the creaking of the wood sounding like a scream in the stillness. Inside the cabin was a shrine to isolation, the air stale and cold. I lit a fire, its crackling flames providing a flicker of warmth amidst the encroaching darkness. As I settled into the worn armchair, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls, adorned with old photographs and hunting trophies, seemed to close in around me, their eyes judging my presence. "Just relax," I told myself, forcing a laugh that echoed hollowly. "It's just a story." But as night fell, the wind picked up, howling like a banshee outside, and I could swear I heard something moving just beyond the cabin's thin walls. I grabbed my notebook, desperate to drown out the growing unease with words. The flickering candlelight danced across the pages, and I began to write, pouring my thoughts onto the paper like a lifeline. But the atmosphere thickened, and soon the scratching at the door began, a low, persistent scraping that sent my heart racing. "It's just the wind," I whispered, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The stories of the Wendigo flooded my mind, tales of insatiable hunger and madness that drove men to the brink of insanity. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Chapter 2. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. I rose, heart pounding like a drum in my ears, and approached the door, my hand trembling on the knob. "Who's there?" I called, forcing my voice to be steady despite the terror clawing at my insides. There was no response, just the eerie silence that enveloped the cabin, wrapping around me like a shroud. With a deep breath, I flung the door open, revealing nothing but the swirling snow and darkness beyond. The forest loomed, an endless expanse of black, and I felt the weight of its shadows pressing against me. I was about to retreat when I noticed tracks in the snow, long, thin imprints that led away from the cabin, disappearing into the depths of the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks, heart racing, each step sending waves of dread coursing through me. The forest was alive with whispers, rustling branches that sounded like laughter, taunting me as I ventured deeper into the abyss. "This is foolish," I muttered, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. The tracks led me to a clearing, and in the center stood a grotesque figure, its body twisted and gaunt, skin stretched taut over bones that jutted out like jagged stones. Its eyes were hollow voids, and as it turned to face me, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over me, a hunger that gnawed at my insides. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, voice like gravel, echoing through the clearing. "Wendigo," I breathed, heart racing as I stumbled backward. The creature smiled, a sickening grin that revealed rows of sharp teeth, glistening with the blood of countless victims. "You came seeking stories, but all you'll find is your end." I turned to run, but the shadows closed in around me, branches clawing at my skin like skeletal fingers. The forest roared to life, the wind howling a symphony of madness as I dashed through the trees, branches snapping underfoot. I could hear it behind me, the creature's breath a chilling whisper that danced along my spine. "Run, little man. It only makes the hunt more fun," it taunted, voice echoing off the trees like a twisted lullaby. I stumbled, falling face first into the snow, gasping for breath as I scrambled to regain my footing. The frost bit into my skin, but I couldn't stop. I had to escape. I raced toward the cabin, heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline driving me forward. But as I neared the door, I skidded to a halt. The creature stood in the doorway, blocking my escape, its eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. "You thought you could leave," it hissed, stepping forward, the shadows swirling around it like dark smoke. "Please," I pleaded, backing away. "I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to write." Its laughter echoed through the night, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "You should have stayed in the city, Edward. Out here, the stories write themselves in blood." Chapter 3. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee again, but the woods conspired against me, branches snapping like brittle bones, roots grasping at my ankles. I could hear it moving behind me, a relentless predator that reveled in my terror. "You can't run from your own darkness," it shrieked, voice rising in a cacophony of madness. I burst through the underbrush and into the clearing, the moonlight illuminating the snow like a shroud over a corpse. I was lost in a labyrinth of fear, the walls of the forest closing in, suffocating me with despair. I could feel the Wendigo's breath on my neck, cold and rancid, and I knew it would not stop until it had me. Desperation clawed at my heart as I stumbled through the snow, slipping and falling, the cold biting into my flesh. "Somebody help!" I screamed, but the only response was the mocking laughter of the creature echoing through the trees. "No one can save you now, little man. You are mine." In a final act of defiance, I turned to face it, my heart hammering in my chest. "I won't become your story," I shouted, but the words felt hollow, a feeble attempt to reclaim my power. The Wendigo stepped closer, its form shifting and writhing, as if it were made of shadows and nightmares. "You already are," it whispered, and with a swift motion, it lunged forward, claws extending like daggers. I felt the cold steel of its grip around my throat, the sharp pain as it pierced my skin, blood spilling into the snow like crimson ink on a blank page. As I gasped for breath, the world around me darkened, and I could feel the warmth leaving my body. "You will be remembered," it hissed, and in that moment, I knew there would be no escape. No one would ever find me here, lost in the woods, consumed by the very stories I had sought to uncover. And as my vision faded, the last thing I saw was the twisted grin of the Wendigo, its eyes reflecting the darkness that had once been my soul. Devoured, hollow, and lost to the cold embrace of the forest. In the end, I became just another tale, a warning whispered among those brave enough to venture into the woods, forever haunted by the insatiable hunger of the Wendigo. Sophie never wanted to move to rural Vermont, but her father's sabbatical left her little choice. The Victorian mansion they rented came cheap. Too cheap, she'd later realize. Her first night shift at the 24-hour diner was unremarkable until 3 a.m. when Carmen walked in. Pale skin, dark hair, vintage clothes that somehow looked timeless. She ordered nothing but black coffee, watching Sophie with eyes that seemed to shift between green and gold. "I work nights too," Carmen said, leaving a $100 tip. She kept coming back, always during Sophie's shifts. They bonded over true crime podcasts and obscure films. Sophie found herself thinking about Carmen's lingering touches, the way she'd leaned too close while talking. The dizzy spells started gradually. Sophie blamed them on her nocturnal schedule, the anemia her doctor diagnosed. She ignored the dreams, a weight on her chest, sharp pain in her throat, the scent of iron. But she couldn't ignore the local news. 3 girls hospitalized with severe blood loss, all regulars at the diner. Or the old photograph she found while researching the mansion's history. A woman from 1872 who shared Carmen's face exactly, down to that peculiar half-smile. The next time Carmen arrived for her usual coffee, Sophie was ready with a silver cross and a UV flashlight. She had questions about a certain Countess Carmilla, and this time she wouldn't take evasion for an answer. Carmen didn't flinch at the cross or the UV light. She simply smiled, revealing perfect teeth. Finally, she said, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. You're cleverer than the others, Sophie." The diner was empty except for them. Outside, snow began to fall, thick and silent. "The others," Sophie said, hand trembling on the flashlight. "Like Rebecca from Morning Shift? Emily from the bookstore? They'll recover. I never take too much." Carmen's eyes had definitely shifted to gold now. "But you're different. I've been waiting centuries for someone who could be a true companion." Sophie backed away. "I've read the stories. You don't want a companion. You want a victim. The stories get so much wrong." Carmen hadn't moved, but somehow the distance between them had shrunk. Bram Stoker, Hollywood, they never understood. "We're not monsters, Sophie. We're survivors, and we're so very alone." The dizzy spell hit suddenly. Sophie grabbed the counter for support, remembering too late that Carmen had been adding something to her water bottle for weeks. "My special tea blend," she'd said, "for energy." "The choice is yours," Carmen whispered, now inches away. "Unlike the stories, I never force anyone. But think about it. Eternal youth, endless time to learn, to grow, to experience everything. No more 9 to 5, no more watching life slip away." Sophie thought about her half-finished novel, her deferred dreams of traveling the world, her student loans. She thought about Rebecca and Emily in hospital beds. She thought about the lonely Victorian mansion and her father, who would never understand. Then she looked into Carmen's ancient eyes and made her choice. The next evening, the diner had a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. 2 regulars, both pale but striking women, were never seen there again. But years later, patrons at underground nightclubs in Prague, art galleries in Buenos Aires, and poetry readings in Kyoto would sometimes mention a pair of mysterious women who seemed to know everything about history because they'd lived it. And if some of their admirers occasionally woke up feeling lightheaded with strange dreams about sharp teeth and golden eyes, well, that was a small price to pay for an unforgettable evening with 2 such enchanting storytellers. Some said the women were running from something, but those who looked closer realized they were actually running towards something. Endless nights, limitless horizons, and the kind of love that only comes once every few centuries. Chapter 1. The old manor stood on the edge of the moor like a gnarled finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Dusk settled over the landscape, draping it in a shroud of uncertainty. I arrived at the dilapidated estate of Count Magnus, a figure whose very name stirred whispers and speculation among the locals. The villagers eyed me with a mix of pity and dread, as if I were a moth drawn to the flame of their darkest fears. "Stay away from that place," one elderly man warned, his voice trembling. "Count Magnus was a monster, and his legacy is steeped in blood." "I'm sure it's just superstition," I replied dismissively, trying to mask the flicker of unease that gripped my stomach. But as I crossed the threshold, the air thickened with an oppressive weight, and the shadows danced unsettlingly in the corners of my vision. The interior was a mausoleum of forgotten grandeur. Dust motes floated lazily in the last light, filtering through cracked windows. I wandered through the neglected rooms, each holding remnants of a life steeped in darkness. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes following me with a hunger I could not comprehend. In one, Count Magnus himself glared down at me, his features twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I found a journal tucked away in the library, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were penned in a frantic hand, detailing the Count's obsession with an ancient ritual, a dark invocation that promised power, immortality, and a price that was all too human. As I read, the words seeped into my mind, filling it with an insatiable curiosity and a growing dread. The townsfolk had whispered of disappearances linked to Magnus, of children who ventured too close to his domain, never to return. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I lit a candle, the flickering flame casting grotesque shadows that leapt across the walls. I felt a pull, a compulsion to unveil the mysteries that lay buried within the manor. The journal spoke of a hidden chamber, a place where the Count conducted his dark rites, and I felt an insatiable urge to find it. Chapter 2. Navigating the labyrinthine corridors, I stumbled upon a decrepit staircase leading down into darkness. My heart raced as I descended, each step echoing ominously in the stillness. The air grew colder, the scent of damp stone and decay wrapping around me like a shroud. As I reached the bottom, I found a heavy door, its wood warped and fissured. With a deep breath, I pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the room was vast, filled with shadows that clung to the walls like desperate hands. A stone altar dominated the center, stained with the telltale marks of sacrifice. Candles flickered around it, their flames casting an eerie glow on the grotesque carvings that adorned the walls. Figures caught in eternal agony, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a soft whisper that seemed to curl around my consciousness. "Join us! Join us!" The voice was a seductive lure, pulling at my sanity, urging me to abandon my fears. I turned, but there was no one there, just the oppressive darkness that enveloped me. I stepped closer to the altar, compelled by an unseen force. Bloodstains told stories of lives extinguished, their essence used to fuel the Count's dark ambitions. I shivered as the realization hit me. The villagers were not merely superstitious fools. They were survivors of a legacy steeped in horror, a horror that I had unwittingly awakened. "Why do you disturb me?" A voice boomed from the shadows, deep and resonant. My heart stopped as the figure emerged, a towering silhouette, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that glinted like shattered glass. Count Magnus stood before me, impossibly alive, his visage twisted in a grotesque parody of a smile. "I seek knowledge," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to understand." "Understand," he echoed, laughter rumbling from his chest like thunder. "You seek understanding, yet you tread upon the bones of those who dared to know. Their screams are my symphony, their blood my wine." He gestured towards the altar, and I felt the weight of countless lives pressing down upon me. Chapter 3. Panic surged within me, and I turned to flee, but the shadows twisted and danced, ensnaring my limbs. The Count's laughter filled the chamber, a cacophony of madness that reverberated in my mind. "You cannot escape what you have awakened. You will join them, become part of the melody." I fought against the darkness, clawing at the air as tendrils of shadow coiled around my throat, squeezing the breath from my lungs. In a desperate act, I grabbed a nearby candle. Its wax dripped and hardened like the remnants of lives lost. I hurled it at the Count, flames illuminating his face for an instant, a mask of rage and hunger. The candle shattered against the altar, igniting the blood-soaked remnants of the past. Flames licked at the walls, consuming the darkness. Screams filled the air, not just from me, but from those long gone, their anguished cries rising like a choir of the damned. "Fool!" Count Magnus roared, the shadows coalescing around him, forming a grotesque shield. "You think you can destroy me? I am eternal." But as the fire spread, the shadows began to wither, their grasp loosening. I seized my chance and bolted for the door, collapsing in a heap as I burst into the hallway. The manor trembled, a living entity in its death throes, the walls groaning as they succumbed to the flames. Behind me, the Count's voice echoed, a twisted lamentation. "You cannot escape the darkness within. It is a part of you now." I staggered into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. The villagers watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of horror and relief. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as the flames illuminated the manor, a beacon of destruction. But even as the fire consumed the estate, I felt it, the lingering presence of Count Magnus, crawling beneath my skin, whispering secrets I could not unhear. The darkness had seeped into my soul, and no amount of fire could cleanse it away. I was forever marked, a living testament to the horrors that lurked in the shadows. And as I looked back at the inferno, I understood. The Count may have been consumed, but his legacy would live on, a festering wound in the heart of humanity, forever binding me to the darkness I could never escape.